Hello, it's Helen Godden here and welcome to my latest YouTube video, How to Paint Budgerigars with Helen Godden and Caran d'Ache Neocolor 2 water-soluble crayons. What a mouthful, but I'm going to show you how we use them with this beautiful budgerigar design, which is from my Feathered Friends collection of e-designs. So we start with the design printed out. It's about 14 or 16 inches. And I've got my calico. Now, some of you call this muslin. It's low quality cotton. It's got seeds and lumps in it. It's very inexpensive, calico or muslin. But what we need to test first is the water flick test, which I've just done. Let's have a look. Focus. There. See how it is? It's got beads. Not bleeding, but beads on the surface. That's what we want. That means this calico has plenty of starch and sizing in it to give us control of where the colours go. Now that's why we don't wash this fabric. We want to have control of the movement and, more importantly, where the colour bleeds or doesn't bleed. Now normally I would use my Panda pencil, but because we're working on a light coloured fabric, we go for the friction pen. So here I'm lining it up, making sure there's a bit of extra space around the pattern, like extra fabric, and it's a good idea to pin that pattern in place. Certainly means you're not going to have movement of the design. I had a problem there with the pin, so I went somewhere else. Now that friction pen, of course, is fine when we paint near it, and then later on it will iron away completely. So you can see through the fabric to the paper pattern quite easily. And so here I am tracing it. You can see my left hand is holding the fabric quite firmly. And I'm just not sure where I've gone, so I've had a little look. Yes, I can see it clearly now here on the camera, but when I was tracing I wasn't certain about that line, so a little check there. That's why the pins are good. It means that you won't lose positioning. Now the tracing doesn't have to be perfect. What it does need though is to be flowing lines. So rather than awkward lines, if you've got a line that flows nicely, even though it's perhaps not quite on track with the pattern, as long as it's flowing and smooth, it'll look fine. Just adding all those details in. Now for this circle, you could get a plate or something and trace around it, but you know what? The whole piece is going to be hand painted and stitched, so it's got a handmade look about it. Nothing has to be perfect. Embrace the imperfection, people. That's what I tell myself anyway. I'm just speeding it up now so we can get through this tracing part. Yes, I can trace fast, but not that fast. So now the background line work, it's got a geometric pattern behind it there, trying to look a bit like patchwork or piecing. I've marked my corners, and I'm still going to draw that by hand. I'm not too worried about that edge, because as you'll see when I paint over that boundary to make sure that I've got plenty of colour for when I trim this block back and get it ready to actually add, borders and sashing. Now I've used a ruler there, you could do that. It's not what I would normally say, but you can certainly do that if you wish. So now I've got my Caran d'Ache Neocolor 2 water-soluble crayons. I've got a set of 15 and 30 on my website, and that's what I'll be using today. But my set looks a bit like this. When I sell the sets, I also sell these little grippers. They're great for when you've got big hands like me and you can't get your fingers on those small bits. Those grippers help you grab onto a small piece of crayon and use it right to the very end. Now I've added a little picture there of a budgerigar, so you can see their beautiful colours. Typically the blue and white, the lime green and yellow. They're a classic Australian bird and very often the pet in the family. So you can see here I have got the video sped up, but you can see I'm literally colouring and scribbling on there, literally just getting pigment on the fabric. I'm not trying to colour in the whole area. I'm just placing colour where I need it, ready for the brush. So it's more about getting enough pigment on the fabric in any given area, ready for the brush. So you can see I've added a few colours together, the greens and blues. I'm just colouring the ends of the leaves, and then I've come back in with another colour. So you can see very poor colouring in skills, but it's more about placing the colour on the fabric, ready for the brush. I am paying a little bit of attention though to the directions. So, you know, the feathers, or for instance the circle here, painting around the circular shape there. You'll notice when we use the brush, most of those actual marks will disappear. Well, let's check it out. See how I've kind of gone against the grain with the pink there? We'll see if we get rid of those markings later on. So pretty rough when it comes to colouring in. Taking those pins out, we certainly don't need the paper underneath the pattern for when we're going to actually use water. Fresh water, paintbrush. I've just got a square-ended chisel. It's about 6 mil. I've got a pointy one there too, but I think I'm just going to use my square-ended one. So you're putting water onto the crayon and mixing it around. It's actually activating the pigment so that you can then continue to spread it and move it into the areas that you want. So you can see how by wetting it once and then working back into it, you start to get rid of the actual colouring in marks. Now I've added a bit more green there, and there I go. I spread it around. You watch, we add the water here, mix it around, and you get rid of those actual drawing marks. I've added some blue, and you can still see how that blends in, particularly because it's still wet. The area is still wet. So what you're not really understanding here is the fact that I'm using this calico / muslin means that those colours are not bleeding beyond the little boundaries or the areas that I have put the wet brush. The colour is completely staying in those areas. Now, later on, I'll show you what happens when two wet areas touch each other. They will share the colour, but the colour will not share into a dry area. And this is why we use the muslin. It's the only fabric that does this. If we were using just straight quality cotton, the colours would be bleeding without our control. So this is where the beauty of the calico / muslin comes in. Now I'm being very careful to not touch that previous wet area, but if it does, it'll bleed in, and you know, that's okay because it's feathery and colourful and, you know, bird-like. Oh yes, notice how the fabric is already starting to distort. The fabric will shrink where I've put the water, so you start to get distortion of the fabric. As you're working, this can be a bit stressful, but I can assure you that by the end of the process, we've wet the whole area, like every area has been wet, so the whole thing will have shrunk fairly evenly. So although it might be distressing you at this point that the fabric is distorting, don't fear, it all sorts itself out later. Now, I'm not actually having a huge amount of water on that brush. I'm not trying to flood the area. But you can see how you can move those colours around and take it from being a scribbly mess to being beautiful, blendy, soft colours. Now, being the white or the cream fabric, I can make a colour lighter by having less pigment on there. Less pigment means more water will show through. So if you want something to be a very light colour, just, for instance, blue sky, a small amount of the blue, lots of water, and you've got pale blue sky. Same as the black here. You can see it's quite dense at the end. I didn't use so much colour at the top there, more water, and we've now got a pale grey. Oh, added a bit more in. I wanted it blacker. Now there, I think I want those marks of the feathers to stay quite distinct with those stripes, so I'm not going to be blending that. Now I'm pre-wetting this area. This is going to be interesting. I'm getting the black and adding the little black feathery marks. Now because I've pre-wet the area, that black is going on and straight away bleeding that little bit, which softens all those shapes. So it'll just sit there and continue to soften and bleed that little bit. You can see that area gradually is getting grey with patterning. So that's the difference of pre-wetting that area. Now even those little black dots, I still will need to touch them with the brush with some water because you want the pigment to be activated and sink in. There's the little markings. If you look back at our budgerigar picture, the little markings on the birds. Now this yellowy area was a bit more dry, so it isn't doing as much bleeding. So now I'm working on the fact that some areas are still are a little bit dry, therefore I can work into them. See, I'm adding some water there to activate the black, which is helping it to bleed just that little bit and giving him the beautiful patterning. There you go, activating those little black bits. But because the background is fairly dry, the black will just sort of stay black and not bleed. This is where it's very hard sometimes to step away and let something dry because I'm so keen to just keep playing. But yeah, sometimes it's a very good idea to take that break, go have a cup of coffee and wait for the certain areas to dry that little bit. Just want more yellow in there, more green in there. You can see I keep adding a bit more light green in there. Yes, you can see how it becomes quite a creamy mix. Now, diving into that background, I'm being quite careful there to not touch the edge of the back of the bird because it will bleed. So I'm taking my time there, but otherwise jumping in with that water. Now take note of how messy my scribbling, my colouring was, and yet how we are able to smooth that out. Once we activate it with the water, we then have pigment and water on there making paint, which we can then move around and get rid of the scribbly lines. It's actually quite satisfying. It means you don't have to be so particular when you're actually doing the colouring in. Being quite careful around those edges there. Now there's one spot on his head there where it's bled. Did you see that? I'm not panicking though. And once it bleeds, you really can't do anything. But you know what? You wait. You'll never even notice it. So truly, if I'd gone off and waited and come back, there'd be no issue of the bleeding. Which is what I think happens next. I think I say to myself, Helen, step away and wait for it to dry. Gosh, I can paint fast, but not that fast, folks. I've decided to do the leaves. Now again, they're quite a scribbly mess, but you look how nicely that colour blends and becomes one. I use different greens to the bird. It's more of a jadey colour, just to get some differentiation between, you know, bird and leaves. Looks like I've come back from my cup of coffee and everything is nice and dry. So now I'm going to think about the background colours. And I've dived in with some dark bluey purple colour. Now you can see when there's some things on the table underneath, it leaves a funny little mark, but that'll still disappear. Pretty rough colouring in there, Helen, but it's going to be fine. It's actually quite satisfying getting in there and having a good old scribble. So just getting enough pigment on there so that when I get the brush and move it around, it'll be covered. So it's not about colouring it in perfectly, it's about getting enough pigment in the area that you want it. Gone for the orange down the bottom there. And then some scarlet. Oh, there was a piece of thread under there and you can see that little mark it's left. That'll disappear when we activate it with the water. So that looks pretty damn rough. Added a bit of pink in there. Now, the difference now is that the first parts that we painted, the birds and the leaves, are completely dry. So I can paint right up to the edge, and the orange might go onto the edge of that leaf, for instance, but it will not activate the green because the green is dry. Okay, it's completely dry. So once something is dry, it is in the fabric, it is no longer able to be activated. So that's why, having gone away and left it to dry, it's much easier now to continue on my merry way without worrying about, for instance, the orange touching the black of the bird's tail and having it all bleed. Okay, so if you can be patient and make yourself walk away and come back to it, that is ideal. I can't always make myself do that. I'm so caught up in the process, but it is ideal. Look at that gorgeous scarlet coming through. Again, I'm painting over the edge of that friction pen where I ruled that line originally for the block, because I want to make sure that I've got plenty of colour so that when this is quilted and then trimmed back, I will have plenty of background colour to still be a complete block without having to, you know, compromise any other areas. So it's like I've left my seam allowance. Now I think there I'm actually taking that colour just that little bit onto the green, which gives us a little dark outline, but it does not bleed. Okay, so that's the beauty. Once it's dry, it will not bleed. So we've done a little bit of speed painting there, just about finished that blue background. And you can see how the marks disappear with the tickle of that brush. I've then gone in and added a bit of blue. It didn't seem to do much. I was trying to have some variation. Still had to activate that with the brush. And I'm still obviously thinking, yeah, I want to break that up a bit in the background. Added a bit of yellow to differentiate between those two orangey areas as they were fairly similar. And then I pick up the blue and start adding spots. Now these are sinking into the wet fabric, but I'm not going to tickle them with the brush because I want them to stay quite distinctly as spots. So kind of making it look like a printed fabric in the background. I think it breaks up the background nicely and it's going to assist me when it comes time to quilting. So here I'm just showing you, I've used about 15 or so colours, or not even that many really, which is pretty well everything from a set of 15. So, you know, and one brush and just a piece of calico. And now it's completely dry, just checking, we're going to iron it. So putting down something for an ironing mat. And we're going to iron from the back first, just in case there's a damp area that our iron then merrily smudges right the way across. So iron from the back, just to be sure, A hot iron, yep, it's on, Helen. Mine has no steam, so that's what we need here. We don't need steam. We're trying to iron this flat. If the wrinkles from the shrinkage did not disappear, that's when I would get a spritz bottle and just spritz the areas that haven't shrunk. But as you'll see, this actually comes up quite well with just an iron to sort it out. This is the only ironing I do, folks. There, that's looking pretty good. Flip it over and have a little look. Lovely. Look at that. The friction pen is gone and we're left with our beautiful, colourful design. Excellent. Thumbs up from Helen. Okay. So now I'm going to take out that ironing mat from underneath and grab a Sharpie, a black Sharpie. Now this is where you might like to use a piece of cardboard with sandpaper on it. It just helps give you a bit of grip so that the fabric will stay put while you are using the Sharpie. I'm on an old cutting mat which is really quite textured from having been used as a cutting mat. So it's got lots of, you know, scratchy marks in it, and that actually kind of helps grip the fabric that little bit. Otherwise, I would be putting my left hand up there and trying to sort of hold that fabric nice and firm whilst I'm using the Sharpie. You can see I'm not hesitating. It's a firm, solid press with that pen, basically putting back all the line work that was there originally, which will then be our stitching line as well. So you don't want a super fine Sharpie. You want the one that says fine on the body of the pen, but it's got that bullet head on it, and it comes out, I would actually class it as medium, not fine. And that's what you want, because any minute now I'm going to be asking you to stitch into that black Sharpie line, and that's when you'll be really wishing it was a little bit thicker. So finding all those lines that we originally traced, but also going with the flow of the paint. If the bird's wing has an extra bump on it or something, well, go with the flow of where the paint has ended up rather than trying to be exactly the same as the pattern. You can really see the difference the Sharpie makes, really bringing this to life, adding the black outlines back in, just like the original pattern. So that strong design element comes through again. I really love how that wing has dried, where we pre-wet it and let the black kind of blend in that little bit into the wet fabric. It's come up really nicely. And it actually looks soft grey rather than black, like the Sharpie is the only black we've got on there. So trying to get that smooth line, being quite positive with your hand movements. Oh, look, there we go. I'm showing you the texture of that board underneath. It really is kind of gripping the job for me. But otherwise, yeah, some fine sandpaper could be the answer, or else holding the fabric like I am doing there with my left hand and getting my head in the way. Lovely. Excellent, Helen. Excellent work getting your head in the way. Love it. Okay, I've moved back now. Outlining those leaves. Finding those abstract sort of pieced background areas. And there we go. I think that's ready. Oh, don't keep fiddling, Helen. Can't help myself. Okay, that's ready to go under the needle. Here we go. Over to the sewing machine now, and I've got all 3 layers sandwiched up. Some batting, some backing. I've got black thread on my machine, and I'm putting in a couple of pins. I don't actually need to because on my machine, I'm on the Handy Quilter Capri. It's got 18 inches of throat. But for most of you, just a couple of safety pins will make sure there's no movement of that backing fabric or the batting. And the first job is needle down, needle up, bring up that bottom thread, and we're going to start stitching in all the black lines. This is when you're really hoping that your Sharpie was not super fine. There we go. Let's start stitching. We might just speed through this section. Yes, everything has to be outlined. Let's just speed on through and get to the good stuff. Now I'm adding some little feathering patterns on his little chest, little continuous U shapes. But what you'll notice is that I keep using that black outline as a way to travel from one area to the next. It doesn't matter how many times you go in that black area. It's black thread on black. You use it as an escape route, as a path, as a track to move from one area to the next. Now it's quite important here, as it is often with the quilting, that the pattern touches the black. So you can see there, for instance, we want that chest feathers to fit underneath the wing. So it needs to touch the edge of the wing to give the illusion of it going underneath the wing. I've added some extra detailing there on his wing, doubling up those little patterns, just giving some extra texture. Now we're moving up to some of those background elements. I'm going to show you a technique I call contour stippling, where I've created one big stipple going across and then I start to repeat it, but I go close and far. See, close and far, just like on Sesame Street. So sometimes it comes in close to the previous stitching and sometimes it goes out wider. And we get this really groovy exaggeration that fills this area, kind of like a moon in the background. And again, see how I use that ditch to travel and move up to the next area. It's so important. I've been distracted by the bird and I'm doing a bit more of the budgie, and I'll come back to that background soon enough. I just keep following that black line, following that path, making sure that everything gets stitched, and sometimes it gets stitched twice in that one black space, and that's okay because we can't tell the black on black. Everyone's concentrating right now. This is the hard bit. Holding my breath. Phew, done. Okay, now I want to try and continue that contour stippling kind of pattern. So in this area here, all you can do is fake it. Okay, it's too small to get anything going. So you just kind of do some wobbly lines that kind of look like it. And then when you've got space, any second now, there you go. You launch off into a big exaggerated stipple that moves across the area. And then you go back in and go close and then far. And then close, and then fa, and you kind of exaggerate it. It's very groovy, baby. And as always, I'm looking for designs that don't require perfection. This is all about having variations. Something that is absolutely perfect, like a cross grid or something, looks terrible unless it's perfect. So I avoid that. I go with something that is a little bit more forgiving. As long as this looks flowing, it'll look absolutely fine. There's no need for it to be perfect. I mean, perfect is boring. Perfect is dead straight. Again, having that touch the birds, you'll see how important it is to make it look like that pattern is behind them. See how I keep using the black path? So when you're in a class with me, I hound everyone about this, but it makes such a big difference to the layering. It really will look like those birds are appliqued onto a piece of pink fabric that had a swirly pattern on it. Okay, let's just power through the rest. Time for a signature, which means we're almost finished. Snip that thread and let's admire our work. Beautiful. You can see how the different quilting has really brought the piece to life, adding so much texture and movement. So when that is trimmed back, given some borders or sashings, it'll look terrific. So I hope you've enjoyed our Caran d'Ache lesson here today. But wait, what about the back? Flip it over, check it out. I had a white bobbin, so I could certainly paint into that with my Lumiere. So I hope you've enjoyed our lesson today on how to use those Caran d'Ache Neocolor 2 water-soluble crayons and creating our budgerigar. If you'd like the other 8 designs that goes with the budgerigars, that is on my website called Feathered Friends, and you can purchase all 9 designs and then have a play with your Caran d'Ache crayons and create a beautiful 9-block bird quilt called Feathered Friends. Hope you enjoyed that. I'll see you very soon. Education and inspiration from HelenGodden.com. Bye.